Virginia, 1873. A season of harvest, of church bells and wagon wheels, yet one farmhouse holds a secret that unsettles the entire valley. A young girl lies silent, her eyes open but distant, caught in a condition no doctor could name, no prayer could lift. Neighbors whisper of curses, physicians turn away, and newspapers carry her story far beyond the county line. Some call her a miracle, others a fraud, but history records her as something stranger still, the girl science refused to study. Arrival of mystery. The year is 1873, and the air in rural Virginia carries the scent of tilled earth and wood smoke. In a modest farmhouse, one family keeps to their daily rhythm of farm chores and Sunday church, yet something within their walls disturbs the calm. Their young daughter, once lively and full of chatter, has begun to fall into long spells of stillness. Her silence stretches beyond sleep, as though she drifts into another place where no sound can reach her. Her parents exchange worried glances at the supper table, their unease growing each day the girl fails to rise with the morning sun. In their home, where the ticking of the clock is usually a comfort, each pause now feels like a question without an answer. Neighbors begin to notice. At first, they think the girl is ill with fever, a common plight in a land where doctors are few and remedies uncertain. But as weeks pass, the symptoms do not follow the familiar pattern. There is no cough, no rash, no clear sign to explain her strange decline. Instead, she seems to exist in a space between wakefulness and absence, her eyes open but unfocused. The family consults the local physician, a man with limited tools and even fewer theories. His visits bring no relief. He listens, takes notes, and prescribes tonics, but each time he departs, the mystery deepens. The girl remains as she was, still and unresponsive, as though untouched by medicine or prayer. Word spreads quickly in the small town, carried from porch to porch, store to store, until whispers circle like restless wind. Some call it a sickness without a name. Others, more superstitious, murmur of curses or spirits. Children repeat the story in hushed voices at school, while adults shake their heads and lower their tones in church pews. Within the farmhouse, the parents try to shield their daughter from gossip, insisting that an answer will come. Yet behind closed doors, fear gnaws at them. They cannot explain what has taken hold of their child, nor can they predict what tomorrow will bring. What began as a quiet concern has become the seed of a story that will outlast their lifetimes. The story of the girl science refused to study. The family's struggle. The farmhouse in Virginia soon became a place of restless motion. Each week, the girl's parents traveled by wagon into the nearby town, seeking remedies from the apothecary, leaflets promising new cures, or advice from neighbors who swore by folk recipes passed down for generations. They purchased herbs, powders, and tonics that smelled sharply of alcohol and roots, pouring them carefully into spoons and hoping for a spark of change. Yet each morning their daughter's condition remained the same. She was present but distant, her silence weighing heavier than words could. The parents' faces grew lined with worry, their hands rough from work but trembling when they touched her small frame, searching for warmth, for a sign that she might stir. Beyond the home, the community's voice grew louder. In the general store, whispers followed the family's footsteps. Some neighbors offered quiet sympathy, pressing coins or jars of soup into their hands. Others were less kind, letting suspicion slip through their words. "It isn't sickness," one muttered. "It's a curse." Another claimed the family must be hiding a shameful truth. Each rumor carried its own weight, shaping the family's reputation in ways they could not control. In a town bound by faith and custom, unexplained events often stirred fear, and fear was quick to turn to judgment. For the parents, the hardest burden was not only their daughter's mystery but also the sharp eyes of those around them. Still they persisted. Letters were written to distant doctors, though many went unanswered. When one physician agreed to visit, he offered only vague theories and little comfort, then moved on to other patients who could be more easily classified. As night fell, the family knelt in prayer, asking for clarity, for a sign that their child would return to them as she once was. The silence afterward filled the room, deeper than before, pressing against their hearts. They told themselves again and again that an answer would come, that their daughter's story would not be left in shadows. But as days blurred into weeks, hope began to flicker, fragile as a candle in the draught of an old wooden house. Doctors at a loss. The arrival of the local physician brought a momentary sense of relief to the family. He carried a worn leather bag filled with instruments of the trade, a stethoscope of brass, small glass bottles, and a journal for his notes. Sitting at the girl's bedside, he checked her pulse, watched her eyes, and listened to her shallow breaths. The room was silent except for the ticking of a mantel clock. After a long pause, he scribbled lines into his notebook, shaking his head. His words were careful but not reassuring. He could not identify the ailment. He prescribed a bitter tonic and suggested fresh air, as though her mystery might dissolve with time. The family, desperate for answers, followed his guidance, though deep down they knew it was little more than ritual. As the girl's condition continued unchanged, her case was carried beyond the small town. A letter was sent to a physician in Richmond, who replied with polite detachment. Another note went farther still, toward a medical college said to study unusual conditions. Yet responses came slowly, and when they did, they offered little hope. One letter, in neat handwriting, dismissed the case as unworthy of further attention, a phrase that cut into the family like a blade. To the medical establishment, their daughter was not a priority but an oddity, an unexplained detail in a world already filled with uncharted illness. The family was left to navigate alone, stranded between science that would not explain and neighbors who whispered of curses. This silence from the doctors grew heavier than the illness itself. Each visit, each note, ended with the same conclusion: there was nothing more to be done. The family's farmhouse became a waiting room with no end, each day marked by uncertainty. The girl remained still, her eyes distant, as if she belonged to a place no one else could see. Her parents pressed forward, but behind their persistence lived a truth they feared to name, that even the most educated minds of their time had chosen to turn away. History would remember this choice not as a cure found or a study undertaken, but as a refusal that gave rise to the story of the girl science would not study. Community divide. By winter of 1873, the story of the girl had become more than a household mystery, it had become a matter for the town itself. On Sundays, when families gathered beneath the steeple of the local church, her name threaded through hushed conversations. Some saw her silence and stillness as a sign from above, a trial sent by God to test faith. A minister preached that the girl's condition carried meaning beyond the body, that it was a warning or perhaps a lesson. Others, however, scoffed at the notion. In the back pews, skeptics whispered that the family was exaggerating or worse, hiding some shameful truth. What had begun as concern was slowly shaping into division, setting neighbor against neighbor in a place where unity was once survival. Children carried the tale further still. At the small schoolhouse, the story of the silent girl became a kind of game, retold in whispers at the edge of the playground. They spoke of her as though she were a ghost already, eyes open but unseeing, caught between this world and the next. For the family, these stories were painful echoes of their private struggle. Each time they traveled into town, they felt eyes upon them, measuring, questioning, deciding for themselves whether the mystery was natural or unnatural. Trust became harder to find. Neighbors who once lent a hand at harvest now kept their distance, uneasy in the presence of what they did not understand. Within the farmhouse, the family closed ranks. Curtains were drawn earlier each evening, lamps lit later each morning. The girl's condition remained unchanged, yet the weight of judgment pressed heavier with each passing day. They prayed, they worked, they clung to what was familiar, but outside their door the story had already taken on a life of its own. It was no longer only about an unexplained illness, it was about fear, belief, and the limits of what a community could accept. In the divide between faith and skepticism, the girl herself remained silent, her stillness shaping not only her family's life but also the very fabric of the town around them. The press arrives. By early spring, the story reached ears far beyond the boundaries of the town. A reporter from Richmond, drawn by rumor and word of mouth, arrived on a dusty carriage road with pen and notebook in hand. He was greeted with caution by townsfolk who warned him not to stir unrest. Yet curiosity pressed him forward, and soon he was seated at the farmhouse, asking questions in the measured tone of a man who smelled a story. He observed the girl in silence, her body unmoved, her gaze unfocused, as if she were listening to a voice beyond the room. With each note he scribbled, the mystery deepened, taking on new shape, not just a private burden but a public tale. Within weeks, his article appeared in print, carrying the headline that would define her legacy: "The Girl Science Refused to Study." The word spread quickly through the state and beyond, carried by trains and riverboats, folded into newspapers that landed on breakfast tables and tavern counters. Readers debated in letters and parlors. Was she a miracle, a fraud, a sign of divine will, or simply an unfortunate child caught in an age of limited knowledge? Each retelling stretched the story further, shaping her into a figure larger than life, even as she remained in her small bed in Virginia, unchanged and unaware of the storm her silence had stirred. For the family, the attention was a double-edged blade. Strangers arrived unannounced, seeking glimpses of the girl as though she were an exhibit. Some came with pity in their voices, others with skepticism sharp as knives. The farmhouse door, once a threshold of welcome, became a barrier against intrusion. The parents, already weighed by fear and fatigue, now bore the scrutiny of the public eye. Their daughter had become a headline, a symbol, a subject for debate, but still she was their child, fragile, present, and mysterious. The press had given her story permanence, but it had also taken it beyond their control. Faith healers and wanderers. With the newspaper stories came an endless stream of visitors, many of them strangers who claimed they carried the power to cure what science could not. Traveling healers arrived with vials of dark liquid, herbs gathered from distant forests, and promises whispered in tones of certainty. Some carried worn Bibles, laying hands upon the girl while reciting prayers of deliverance. Others came dressed as men of medicine, brandishing certificates whose origins were unclear. Each visitor declared that their method would succeed where others had failed, yet each attempt left the girl unchanged. She lay still, her silence unbroken, while voices filled the farmhouse with insistence and hope that soon faded into disappointment. The family found themselves torn between belief and caution. To turn away a healer risked being called faithless, to welcome one risked being branded gullible. They listened patiently, nodded, and allowed treatments that did no harm, but every night they returned to their own uneasy prayers. Outside, the crowd grew restless. Neighbors gathered near the gates, some curious, some skeptical, watching as wagons came and went. The farmhouse, once a private refuge, had become a stage for strangers who sought not only to heal but also to be seen. Each failure left the parents more weary, their hope thinned by promises unkept. In town, these visits only deepened the divide. Believers pointed to each attempt as proof that the girl was special, chosen, perhaps even sacred. Skeptics dismissed the healers as opportunists, preying upon desperation. And yet the visits continued, for mystery is a force that draws people even when answers remain absent. The girl herself remained at the center of it all, silent as ever, her mystery untouched by prayers, potions, or proclamations. Her story was no longer only about illness or science. It had become a mirror in which every visitor saw their own reflection: faith, doubt, ambition, or fear. Disappearance from record. By late 1873, the trail of written evidence around the girl began to thin. County ledgers that once noted her family's visits to town listed fewer and fewer entries. Neighbors who had spoken freely now grew quiet when asked about her. In census rolls and medical notes, her name faded into absence, as though she had slipped from the record without a trace. Historians searching the archives today find only fragments: a line of expenses for medicine, a vague mention in a church record, a note in a physician's correspondence that leads nowhere. What happened within the farmhouse after those final notations remains uncertain. The silence of paper reflected the silence of memory. Families who once whispered about her grew reluctant to pass the story down. Perhaps they feared ridicule, perhaps the tale was too strange to fit into a world that valued certainty. Oral traditions that survived into the next generation offered only faint echoes. Some recalled a girl who slept through seasons. Others spoke of the silent child who was present one year and gone the next. Yet no death notice has surfaced, no burial ground named with certainty. In a century where most lives were recorded in some fashion, hers became a life swallowed by absence. For the family, this disappearance from record may have been both loss and relief. With no doctors returning and no neighbors visiting, the story receded from public view. The farmhouse returned to quiet routine: fields planted, meals prepared, prayers whispered. Whether the girl's condition ended in recovery, passing, or lifelong silence is unknown. What remains is the outline of a life partially seen, preserved not in certainty but in questions. In the end, history does not speak of her fate, it speaks of her vanishing, a gap in the archives that tells its own story of neglect, mystery, and the limits of memory. Folklore and memory. In the years that followed, the story of the girl did not vanish entirely. Instead, it shifted shape, carried in whispers and retold at the edges of campfires and porches. Children grew up hearing fragments from parents who half believed what they said: that a girl once lived in the valley who spoke no words, who seemed to sleep with her eyes open. Some called her the silent child. Others insisted she could hear voices that no one else could. The facts thinned, but the wonder grew, reshaped into legend. With each telling, her image blurred, not the frail daughter of a family in need, but a figure of eerie fascination. By the turn of the century, her story had become part of local folklore, mingled with ghost tales and frontier myths. Neighbors spoke of seeing her shadow in fields, or of dreams in which she appeared, unchanging and timeless. Amateur writers collected these stories in notebooks, adding dramatic flourishes that may never have happened. Some accounts claim she lived for decades in the farmhouse, ageless, untouched by time. Others declared she disappeared overnight, taken by forces unseen. In the absence of records, imagination filled the void, and the girl's story became less about truth and more about the human need to explain what cannot be understood. What is certain is this: the girl's condition, whatever its nature, left behind an imprint larger than her short presence in the record books. She became part of the region's identity, woven into the fabric of stories that blurred history with legend. Her silence echoed across generations, not because of what was known, but because of what was never written down. Folklore preserved her when science and documentation did not, ensuring that the girl who baffled doctors would not be entirely forgotten. She became a symbol of mystery, a reminder of the limits of knowledge in an age where answers were often just out of reach. Legacy of the unexplained. Today, the story of the girl whose science refused to study lingers at the edge of both history and legend. What little is known places her firmly in 1873 Virginia, in a rural farmhouse where a family struggled with questions that medicine could not answer. Beyond that, her life is marked more by silence than detail. Yet in that silence lies a lesson: the limits of 19th-century science, and the choices made about which cases deserved attention and which were left behind. Her fate reminds us that history is not only the record of what happened, but also the record of what was ignored. For the family, her story may have ended in private sorrow, but for the wider world, it continues as a parable about knowledge and its boundaries. Scholars note that during this era, doctors often dismissed unusual cases as unworthy, leaving families to face mystery alone. The girl's experience shows how a life can be shaped not only by illness, but also by the absence of recognition. She is remembered not for what science discovered, but for what science chose not to see. That decision turned her from a patient into a symbol, one who represents the many who lived with unanswered questions. Her legacy endures not in medical journals, but in whispers, headlines, and folklore. She stands as a reminder that the past is filled with mysteries unresolved, stories unfinished. In the fields of Virginia, the farmhouse may be gone, the ledgers faded, yet her name survives as a haunting echo. She is the girl whose silence spoke louder than explanation, whose presence revealed the gaps in knowledge of her time. And so she remains, part child, part legend, part unanswered question, a legacy of the unexplained. Her story fades not with answers but with questions. In the autumn of 1873, a Virginia farmhouse became a stage where science, faith, and fear collided. The girl at its center left no diagnosis, no clear ending, only silence, preserved in rumor and ink. She reminds us how much of history rests in shadows, how easily lives slip through the cracks of record and memory. If her mystery still lingers with you, journey deeper into the past with us. More stories wait, forgotten, chilling, and unresolved. Subscribe and let history's unanswered voices find you.